Evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to King's College, welcome to King's Politics and to Fitz Debating. Tonight we've got a bit of a collaboration between ourselves at King's and the guys over at Fitz. Really cool debate. This house believes individualism is failing, and some really cool student speakers to help us work out whether that is true or not. We have got an event next Monday with Professor Beate Yarn, who'll be here in person in Keynes Hall. She's one of the top international relations professors in the world. She'll be talking about critical IR theory and its relation to the culture war and what that means. So hopefully that'll be a really interesting session. 5 o'clock, you're all welcome, free, open to everyone. Bring your mates, should be fun. Fitz Debating, I've got another debate in a couple of weeks, and all their events are on the Fitzwilliam Debating Facebook page. So give that a follow, see what's on, and you might fancy yourself over at Fitz at some point. We've got Natasha here from Fitz Debating, who will chair tonight's debate, and I'll hand over to you to get things going.
Right, thank you. Thanks very much, Tom, for introducing. My name's Natasha. I'm the president of Fitz Debate, and I'm from Fitz. Everyone welcome to come in. So thank you everyone for hosting, especially in a really cool hall, and hopefully we have a really great debate lineup for you tonight. So the motion tonight is that this house believes that individualism is failing, and just a note that this debate is being recorded as well. So on the proposition, we've got Sana, who's a second year at Newnham. Second speaker, we have Elliot, who's a first speaker at Fitz. And we had a third speaker. Unfortunately, her neighbor has COVID, so cannot make it tonight. On the opposition, we've got first speaker Ollie from Fitz, second speaker Dan from Fitz as well, and lastly we have Saifullah, who's from Downing. So this is our lineup for tonight. So the debate structure is going to be like this. We've got our first proposition followed by our first opposition, and then we have a chance for questions. So this is open to debaters to ask each other questions. Also the audience members, if you do have any questions, just raise your hand. Tom will come around with the mic and you can direct it to anyone. And then after that questions, we will have second proposition, second opposition, and then third opposition, since we don't have a third proposition. And then again, we'll have questions at the very end if anyone does have anything they want to say. Each speaker has 5 minutes in their speech. At 6 minutes, I'll ask you to please finish your speech. And speakers, you're more than welcome to speak from the table or our lectern. Is our mic working on the lectern? Yeah, cool. So more than welcome to speak from the table or from the lectern.
Let me begin by saying that I strongly agree with the points the proposition just made. There are deep problems with the Western world at the moment. There needs to be significant change. Yet, unfortunately for the proposition, that is not the discussion tonight. I do promise that I will request another debate so that the first speaker can reuse that speech on the problems the current society faces in the light of the pandemic and other issues. But the issue tonight is individualism failing? Not is it dying, is it being reduced? I'd also like to oppose and rebut the suggestion that individualism is, as you say, putting the self above the collective. Individualism is not about self-interest and prioritizing one's own agenda. Indeed, you can have individualists like John Rawls putting his difference principle forward, arguing that what is most important for society is to improve those least represented and least well off. So individualism isn't an inherently selfish ideology, and therefore cannot be said to be failing as a result of this. What is at issue tonight is whether individualism, the philosophical and ideological underpinnings of the Western world, is failing. As such, the serious problems in the West, which I completely agree with the criticisms you have leveled, and subsequent speakers in your team may also highlight them, they are not significant to the discussion tonight if they are not the result of individualism. The serious problems which the West and individualism faces are not relevant tonight if they do not render the Western world in a far worse condition than societies around the globe which are underpinned by differing philosophical and ideological systems. As a chamber, we must retain the legitimacy of our decisions by not basing them on abstract and utopian views on how the world should be. We can only declare individualism as failing and therefore in need of replacing if individualist societies are in a far worse state than comparative ones around the globe. I urge you to oppose the motion before you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, because individualism as a philosophical concept is not failing and indeed is still highly successful. And because, however apparent the issues which Western nations experience are, they are far better than the alternatives presented around the globe, and so should not be viewed as failing. So, my first point is that the key question of tonight is the philosophy of individualism failing us? I believe it is not, and here is why. At the heart of individualism is that individual people are of central importance. And it is the cultivation of our individuality that we can develop. A thinker far greater than myself asked the question, what more can be said of any state of human affairs but that it brings human beings nearer to the best thing they can be? And the question all of us must consider tonight when voting on this motion is, what worse can be said of any obstruction to good? And I call to mind the collectivism which the proposition argued for, than that it prevents this. When you look at the proposition side, you can see that we're quite a lazy bunch, particularly those of us from Fitz. And we've chosen this side of the debate because our role is far less strenuous. The assumption is in favour of individual freedom. The burden of proof lies with the proposition who is to restrict and prohibit our liberties and individualism. While the ontological claim that the individual comes first may appear philosophically attractive, and prioritizing freedom may be intuitively appealing, why does this mean that in practice, individualism is not failing and actually succeeds? This is because from this claim, it follows that each person has unique capacities and freely chosen development. And the choice to do this confers value in their life. Indeed, only regimes which protect people's individuality can achieve this. That is why individualist societies have facilitated and led to the flourishment of modern pioneers, such as Bill Gates and Elon Musk. That is why it facilitates creativity, genius, and even art itself. That is why our society can celebrate the life and works of Oscar Wilde, the classic individualist, who refused to conform to social norms and produce works of genius. And this leads me to my second point, that not only is the philosophical basis of individualism not failing, but also that the individualist principles which underpin the political system of the Western world is not failing. We can see this when we compare the state of individualist political systems with that of other systems around the globe, especially the primary alternative to individualism, which is collectivism. We see how individualism, in prioritizing in the individual, encourages human rights and political freedoms in the West, which collectivist societies often lack. Take the lack of political freedoms in China and the treatment of their Rohingya population. We also see that individualist political systems succeed far more than opposing systems when it comes to political governance. Individualist societies, the weakness of in-group pressures and an emphasis on personal achievement contributes towards a more meritocratic and efficient public sector. So, therefore, the problems which the West faces are not best solved by abandoning the individualism and replacing it with the collectivism we see around the world and which is proposed by the other side. But we instead think it's best by implementing individualist principles more effectively. So, ladies and gentlemen, if the motion before us tonight was this House believes there are serious problems with the Western worlds, I would urge you to oppose it. If the motion was this House believes the Western world is failing to properly apply the ideas of individualism, I would urge you to oppose it. However, these are not the motions. The question before us tonight is individualism failing? And I urge you to answer with a resounding no. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our first speaker from the opposition. So now we open the floor and to speakers, if they do have any questions they want to direct to the speakers who have already spoken, feel free to raise your hand, or if any of the speakers want to say anything.
Lovely, thank you there. Sorry, I just wanted to go on the thing with regard to what the last speaker said. So you talk quite a lot about the West and about how the West, the individualism that we have is a good thing. Within your kind of model, is that not a bit kind of, it's not a bit kind of unfair to the other side, because the logics of imperialism mean that outside of the global north, other kind of systems that are going to be able to create it are inevitably going to be materially significantly worse off. And how do you kind of reconcile that within the individualism of the West and that kind of comparison and contrast you're giving between cultures?
Does anyone else have any questions, either from the floor or from the speakers?
They're not showing that individualist ideas are no longer applicable. Indeed, the lockdowns that have been implemented are actually a manifestation of individualism. They're closing down countries to increase people's liberties, to protect them from illnesses. And so we can see all the measures that have been introduced are actually further evidence for the success of individualism.
It seems that you're making quite the logical leap when you're saying, well, our current society is failing and our current society is individualist. Therefore, we are failing because of individualism. Whereas I think blaming the effects of a global pandemic on individualist theories is quite dangerous and quite the equivocation to make, in my view. As for this idea that lockdown is an individualist principle or collectivist principle, that's really besides the point. And I think if you came to the last King's debate that I was at, the lockdown hasn't been a success by any means. And that's not due to individualism. That is largely due to a suppression of individualism. So you have to draw a logical link between the failures and individualism rather than saying, well, global pandemic, therefore individualism is failing.
I was wondering, in bringing up the pandemic and collectivism in that sense, you seem to suggest to me that individualism is proposes selfishness and is somehow in conflict with community action. Do you think the two are in conflict, or could they be reconciled as well?
I think you're slightly misconstruing the theories of collectivism and individualism. Individualism places the individual at its heart and says it's the most important thing in the whole theory, whereas collectivism places society as preeminent. And so an individualist can still say that we have to modify society and impose regulations in order to protect these liberties, i.e. they can impose state intervention to protect people from a public health issue. And so all these measures and all these things are not necessarily collectivist. They can still be individualist.
An example of that is imposing lockdown for individual benefit, and having a qualified lockdown is very individualist. If you want to go down the conservative government route of implementing punishments for breaking COVID restrictions that exceed those for sexual assault and possession of a firearm with criminal intent, that is very clearly collectivism at play at the expense of individualism, because you're chucking individual rights out the window to benefit the community. So would you say that such extreme measures, such extreme suppression of the individual for the benefit of the community is ever justified?
I was just going to say, we'd very much like to not be associated with the current Prime Minister. But I think you are, again, using an extreme example. I think we're also getting quite bogged down on COVID, and this is a debate about individualism and whether it's failing. And I'd quite like to focus the debate on that rather than this idea of Western culture and COVID, because there are lots of other factors at play in that. I think that was the point the gentleman made over there about how history and economic wealth play impact on the idea that the Western world is better off, and therefore individualism as a result is also good. So I think I'd just like the opposition to focus back on individualism rather than COVID.
Had a question from the audience?
The nation that the opposition put out as an example of individualism at its finest is the United States, one of the nations with one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, with 40 million people living in poverty. Do you think that that level of poverty, of a lack of positive freedom as a society is not enabling anyone to achieve their potential. Does that not exemplify how individualism, especially in the 21st century, is inherently failing millions of people and their livelihoods?
Well, I think it's quite a stretch, to say the least, to connect the many, many failings of American society to individualism. I mean, well, that's not exactly my point. I am not connecting all successes of any nation simply on this one point. I think in the case of the United States, you've got, their highly deregularized economic system, which I don't think is fundamentally individualist. You can explain that in different ways. You've got, their history, clearly dominant racist undertones / overtones, which are derived from the history. And I don't see, for example, how those are linked to individualist ideology, for example, at all. And many things characterize a nation, including the US. And I really can't see how you're pinning it all on this one point, especially since other countries in Europe, for example, who are also relatively individualist, got quite different problems. They got their own problems, but they're not necessarily the exact same as the US, for example.
The other side of the spectrum, what's the alternative? Look at China and their emphasis of the community over the individual. Very different problems, but far more dangerous problems.
I just had a question for the opposition. So obviously the argument is that individualism works better than a collectivist system. Do you think that's the case in all aspects of policy? So for example, do you think individualist healthcare systems, like the one that's operated in the US, where you have a private choice of medical insurance, operates more effectively than a collective healthcare system like the NHS in this country? Because if it doesn't, then that suggests one area where individualism is failing because it's being overused.
The motion is individualism is failing and not an area of individualism is failing. And it is not necessary to our arguments and to win this motion that individualism is successful in every regard. I think every debate, every motion, there are nuances. I don't think any of us would commit to an unqualified interpretation of individualism. By an individualist society, we mean one that places individualism at its heart. And obviously you have collectivist communitarianist policies. In communitarian societies, you'll have individualist policies. But we shift more towards this side of the spectrum than the other. That is what we are saying.
I'd like to expand upon his point about the nuance of individualism and collectivism. The whole spectrum of individualism includes a variety of political and economic viewpoints that ranges from laissez-faire economics to a greater role of the state, including in Medicare and other health-related issues. So any political preferences anybody in this room holds as to whether certain aspects of government intervention are justified or not justified don't contravene any aspect of individualism, since the political breadth of it is very large.
I'll allow one more question and then we'll move on to our speakers.
Hi, I just want to go back to something that I think was at the core of your argument, which was you were sort of celebrating art, literature, genius of Western society. You mentioned Oscar Wilde and other people, but I think that's quite a dangerous assumption that you've made, like that the link between that and individualism. There was no explaining kind of the link between, but also other cultures that have collectivist approaches or simply that just don't ascribe to individualism have beautiful, complex art, culture, literature, have genius people coming out of them, people winning Nobel Prizes. If anything, I think we have more Nobel Prize winners that are non-European, but please don't at me on that one. But I think that's something that's dangerous to say. It's very Eurocentric. So I think, yeah, just what do you think about that, really?
I'm very sorry if I missed out any justifications or links in my speech. I was trying to be as brief as possible. In no way am I suggesting that any society has higher caliber individuals, more creativity, more genius. What I'm trying to get across is that the whole principle of individualism is celebrating the individual and individual achievements and the creativity that comes with it. So not only is this integral to the philosophy itself, but also it's more greatly encouraged by it, since it's encouraging people to not conform to social norms, to make changes, as opposed to a collectivist society, which places the community at its center rather than individuals and they're breaking social norms.
On that point, so it's not necessarily a case of the West against the West or Eurocentrism. So I'll elaborate on this in my speech. But for example, my home country of Denmark is a very communitarian society. And yes, we have Nobel Prize winners, Niels Bohr, for example, but nobody celebrates his achievements. He has one institution named after him and that's it. Because the society does not emphasize individual achievement, it is seen as inappropriate. It is seen as wrong to celebrate the successes of its members. And you will always have stagnation in culture, in art, in achievements as a result. So I do think perhaps, whilst not a clear link, there is a link between the flourishing of achievements in societies that place the individual heart and center and those that do not.
Does the proposition have anything to add? Great. All right. Thank you everyone for your questions. We will now move on to the second half of the debate. May I please welcome the second speaker of the proposition.
Yeah, that's working. Right. So we've heard quite a lot about individualism to do with economics and philosophy. And I wanted to try and focus on whether individualism is actually delivering what I think to be the most important kind of criteria for judging whether something is useful to us all, is whether it is improving people's lives. So I want to use also the unit that people use when they talk about individualism, the individual, to explain why individualism is bad for the individual and not just society, which I think, my partner, that was my partner's kind of theme. What makes us truly fulfilled and happy as people is not the things you get from the individualist perspective. The things that actually truly give people happiness and contentment in life, which again is what I would urge people to use as a measurement of determining whether something is valuable for us, is the stuff that you get from other people. So your bonds of family, friendship, love, those are the things that come from bonds with other people. And I'd argue strongly on this, that those bonds are not best served from an individualist perspective. The individualist kind of mentality and ethos prioritizes, like we've heard, achievements in arts, science, status, things like that. Those achievements are all well and good, but we do know in the long run, the things that people truly value aren't those things. So for example, the best example I've ever heard of someone explaining this to me is picture when we're all hopefully very old and had lovely lives on our deathbeds. What do you ask for? Who do you want there? Nobody asks for their Ferrari or their Nobel Prize or their, hopefully first from Cambridge. People ask for their family and their friends. Those are the people they want around them. In those last moments of your life, you don't ask for the things that the material world will get. Sorry, Ollie. I know Ollie would love to interrupt me. So those things, and what I've got a feeling he might say, is those things can still be gained through individualism. But I would argue, I see some nodding, I'd argue no, that those things are not best suited from the individualist perspective, because individualism necessarily puts us, its focus is on yourself. It puts us into groups where your sole focus is firstly yourself, when actually the way you gain friends and the way you hold on to your family connections and find loved ones comes from meeting and sharing experiences with other people. And so my point is not about whether individualism is better for the economy or its philosophical roots, because to be honest, that's not what I'm interested in. I believe the best criteria for measuring whether something is useful is the impact it has on people's lives. And we had quite a long question section. And I think some of those points raised in there can be used to illustrate this. So Ollie talked about the individual at heart. And I believe this is true, that when you start along the path of individualism, you end up, hi Steph, hi Ollie. You end up going down a route where the focus becomes the individual above making connections with others. And then this then leads, into another. Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah, why it's failing. So this leads, I believe it's a natural cause that when you start focusing solely on the individual, it progresses upwards. So you start then focusing, say, on the individual. I need to get into Cambridge, for example. That means I need to work really hard. That means once I get in, I need to get a good job. I'm sure there's people here who are already trying to do summer internships and things like that, focusing on those things. But I'd argue that once you promote a culture where an individual is the sole cause of what we seek to achieve, that our achievement is the only thing that matters, I think you then go down that path very quickly of becoming isolated into that individual. I don't believe you can marry the ethos of individualism, which I'm sure they'll try and argue, with a truly balanced perspective where you seek to make your bonds with people. And I'm not a chemist, but I do remember from GCSE that you release energy when you make bonds. You have to take it in to destroy them. So I'd urge everyone to think the positive energy you get from making bonds and use that to inspire you to vote for the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now welcome the second speaker of the opposition.
We've seen so far tonight that individualism and the question of whether or not it may be said to be failing, it's quite a broad idea and different angles of approach are possible. We've already seen different approaches tonight. I want to focus on what I think is the core of the issue, which is the relationship between the individual and the community. And I will argue that individualism isn't a choice. It isn't an ideology like socialism or neoliberalism may be. And in that sense, it doesn't mean anything to say that it is failing. Rather, individualism is a necessary consequence of the human condition and a prerequisite for human happiness. We don't choose to be individualists. We are. The individual is the fundamental unit of the human world, just as the atom was long thought to be the unit of the physical realm. And of course, as the proposition pointed out, relationships with other people in whatever shape or form are incredibly important, but it is always us, the individual, who chooses to what extent we allow these relationships to define us. For example, I am a son, a brother, a Dutchman, a European, a Natski, a Fitzwilliam, and all these things are important to me, but to different extents. And it is my choice to what extent I let these things define me. And these choices may vary with time. I probably would define myself now differently than I would 3 years ago or will in 3 years' time. And the community is important in the lives of most people, but I think we misunderstand what a community, what a society truly is. A community isn't the sum or average of all its individual that compose it. It's not something above the individual level. Consider a sports team. A sports team isn't the average of all its players. It is its players. It is their interactions, their qualities, their individualities. And in exactly the same way, a community is its individuals. And only when individuals are fully allowed to thrive can the community be successful, happy as well. I think this is best exemplified when we look at situations where communities break down and no longer function. So an important community for almost all of us is our family. I myself am incredibly happy with the family I was born into, but sadly that's not the case for everyone. So historically, just to give one example, many members of the LGBT community have not been accepted by the family they were born into, their parents, and have felt like they weren't able to fully express their individuality in terms of sexuality or gender expression within that family. And in that moment, once you got in that situation where you feel no longer able to be yourself, such a community, which is valuable to so many of us, can break down. And what we then see as well, on the other hand, is that in many LGBT communities, there has arisen the tradition of what is called a chosen family, where you have a group of friends, of mentors, people you say, I care deeply about these people, and these are now my family, and you choose your community, always approaching it as an individual. And I think in that example of the chosen family, all it does is make explicit something which is always present in any community. We enter each community as an individual, and it is valuable as much as it allows each individual that is part of it to be who they are. Another example, historical, I think, where we've seen the same problem is in societies where some sort of community spirit has been imposed from above. Examples are the failed communist experiments in Soviet Russia, or Cuba, for example, which may have been successful to some extent, but because they didn't allow the individuals within them to be themselves, to express their individuality, they were ultimately not successful. And of course, communities are incredibly important, and most of us are a million times happier because of those groups, those relationships that we have in our lives. However, they can only be valued and must only be approached from the individual perspective, simply because at the heart of it, we are individuals. Unlike what the proposition has been arguing tonight, I don't think that individualism is an ideology, an idea. It is a reality. I hope that you will vote for our side tonight, because individualism is not only not failing, it can't be failing, because it's not a choice we make, it is fundamentally who we are. Thank you.
Thank you for the second speaker. Because we don't have a third speaker on the proposition due to COVID reasons, I'll now pass on to the third speaker of the opposition.
Allow yourselves to picture a town, a small, cozy, picturesque town in rural Denmark, the happiest country on earth. This is the town of Yen. This town has 10 rules carefully crafted to fulfill its desire to preserve harmony, social stability, and uniformity. Yen alone, the law of Yen. You're not to think you are anything special. You're not to think you are as good as we are. You're not to think you are smarter than we are. You're not to imagine yourself better than we are. You're not to think you know more than we do. You're not to think you are more important than we are. You're not to think you are good at anything. You're not to laugh at us. You're not to think anyone cares about you. You're not to think you can teach us anything. The town of Yen is the satirical construct of a Danish author, a fiction, a dystopia. But is it? Such insidious social attitudes are an arguably quintessential aspect of contemporary Danish society, and of any communitarian society that pursues harmony at the expense of the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of its individualism. Invective directed against individualism is often founded on the simple utilitarian premise that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Society is your monarch, the community your soul. If falling in line and fulfilling your ovine obligations benefits the greater good, then so be it. Let us accept for a moment the proposition's assertion that a society without, or with restricted individualism, is a happier society. As dubious as that claim may be, I am not here to rebut it. I make the more principled argument that regardless of how harmonious such a society may be, the sacrifice and suppression of individuality is too high a price to pay. Communitarianism by definition works in the interests of the community. To accomplish this, it assesses the interests of the average member of said community, the normal people. The result is a utopia for the people who fit this description, the man on the Clapham omnibus for the lawyers among you. Less so if you do not. Individualism is perceived as a threat to such a society because it measures its success not by reference to the aims of the community, but by reference to the ambitions of each of its individual members. There is no space for outsiders, the Hamiltons and the Gatsbys of this world, those who are non-stop, those who reach out towards the green light across the bay. These are not bold assertions applicable only to books, musicals, and foreign lands. They are much more personal to myself, and I imagine many of you sat here tonight. Regardless of college or course, the fact that you are sitting here today suggests a degree of individual aspiration on your part. And unless you attended Eton, this aspiration would have necessarily set you apart from the crowd. How many of you have been called overachieving, overambitious, shunned for your unique interests and talents, mocked for gazing up at the stars? You are most likely sitting here tonight, not despite, but because of individualism. And it is only through individualism that people like us can flourish and institutions like this can survive. My friends, I call on you to defend individualism, for it is individualism that defends us. Individuals may be failing, but to attribute this to individualism would be a dangerous equivocation. The law of Ghent need not be the law of this house.
Thank you very much to all the speakers for finishing their prepared speeches. I now again open the floor and to the speakers to ask each other any questions, especially proposition, since you are missing a member. Do you have anything you want to start off with?
Just on the point about how I've forgotten the name of the Danish village, but it sounded a lot like the village out of Hot Fuzz. But I thought it was quite interesting because you seem to suggest that our whole argument was based on the fact that we want harmony and uniformity, which we haven't said at all, and is something you've created. What we're saying is simply that individualism is failing because it is not delivering the happiness and the satisfaction people have in life, because it doesn't seek to address the main issues and challenges facing happiness in life, which again, I pointed out, is not about achievements or self-freedoms, that happiness comes from more deeper and more personal things. And that by our goal, similarly, is to try and promote happiness for the individual. And that, which is to say, we all agree that's good. You're essentially saying you need individualism to do it. And we're saying, actually, individualism is failing to achieve that, and therefore should be considered to be failing anyway, because the metric we're using isn't harmony, it's happiness.
Firstly, off the bat of the bizarre statement that we don't want harmony, we want happiness. Going into that, you seem to have fundamentally misunderstood what this debate is about, what individualism is and what collectivism is. Your argument not based, I'm speaking, let me finish. Your argument saying that we don't want to talk about the interests of the community. Let's talk about our own definition of individualism, our own definition of collectivism. Let's talk about relationships. Now, collectivism must mean that we love our family members, right? If you have a wife, if you have a girlfriend, if you have sisters, mothers, brothers, well, you can't be an individual, right? But that is not the charge directed against individualism. I don't think it's what any prominent scholars who launch invective against individualism say. Individualism simply means that the needs of the individual are prioritized, and through that, individual happiness succeeds and the happiness of the community succeeds. If you say that's failing, by your own argument saying, well, prioritize relationships, but you can do that through individualism. We give individuals the choice to pursue relationships. To attack individualism would essentially say, if pursuing relationships is contrary to the needs, to the wishes to the health of the community, then do not do that. So I think we can both agree that we want, as you said, happier people, that we both want harmony, although you saying that you don't want harmony in the community is quite an interesting statement given the nature of this motion. But you saying that we should value relationships does absolutely nothing to undermine our position and our argument tonight.
So obviously, so you mentioned with the thing about self-actualization and making sure that I think you meant that through community action, everyone's at least basic needs can be met, and then we can go up sort of higher order needs, etc. And you brought up, how important interpersonal relationships are. But as I discussed in my speech, I think there is absolutely no contradiction between those things and individualisms, because all those things, working together to achieve common goals, entering relationships with other people, being parts of groups, communities, no matter when we do that, and of course, I think there's a lot to be said in favor of doing so, we always do that as an individual. We always remain an individual, and that always remains the cornerstone of what we do and who we are, I think.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of the arguments so far have been rather hypothetical in nature. I'd like to draw back to some of the examples which were given during the speeches. If we set aside coronavirus and the lockdowns, because we've seen they can be both individualist and collectivist in nature and motivation, what other movements have we seen in society recently which have either truly endorsed collectivism or truly abolished individualism? The biggest example was the rise of the LGBT plus community, individual expression, which has seen a rapid increase in the recent years, to the extent that it's even changed the laws of our own country. Surely examples such as that show that society itself, irrespective of hypotheticals and theoretical arguments, society itself is choosing to maintain its path down individualist society sort of principles. And it certainly is not slowing down. Do you have any examples against that?
I think these movements you describe, I think what they show is that it pays off and it's good to work together, but you do so to be able to express your individuality. I think things like LGBT emancipation are about each individual person who identifies as whatever they identify as, to be themselves. Similarly, I think Black Lives Matter is not about sort of vague community. It's about every individual living their life free of oppression. And just because people work together for that common goal, I think doesn't make it anti-individualist.
The premise of suppressing these kinds of movements has always been, from a collectivist standpoint, the tyranny of the majority. Well, the rights of the minority are not factored into the community at large. Individualism being a threat, therefore we don't care about them. So the rise in Black Lives Matter, the rise in movements like this, as my friend just said, is very much an expression of individualism. And the very fact that you have a group of individuals coming together does not then remove the individual from individualism.
Well, I'd just add quickly that individualism as a concept, as an idea, I think what we see is it's a very nice idea, but when it comes into practice, we see that it's only those at the top. You mentioned tyranny of the majority, but it's only really those with exceptional status or privilege or power who actually get the realization of complete self-actualization. So the idea that individualism is access and open to all, I'd argue it isn't, because we had the example earlier of America being supposedly the most individualist nation, but incarcerating the most people. We also know America is highly poor when it comes to things like racial issues or, say, abortion rights in several states. So I think we do need to be careful that this idea that that individualism is accessible to everyone. I'd say that's a good example of where, sorry, on your point of where it's failing, is that I would use that as an example in the modern sense that individualism isn't accessible to people who don't have status or power. And then again, there is your point about, I think it was right at the beginning about happiness and versus harmony stuff. And I think that's what individualism should be, but it's not, because it promotes the self-centered image. It promotes the prioritization of the kind of material, the selfish interests above and beyond that. That's why I don't think you could have the self-happiness that we were discussing with individualism.
I'll allow one more response.
Yeah, so right there, you have just equated materialism and individualism. In individualism, the emphasis is on the individual to achieve what they want to achieve. If you want to graduate with a PhD from Cambridge, work your whole life, become very rich, then that is on you as an individual. Similarly, if you want to value these more meaningful connections, that is on you. Just because you are an individual within an individualist system does not necessarily mean you're a materialist. I would consider myself quite ambitious. I would consider myself something of a quintessential individualist. I love my family. I value my friends more than I value my debates or my exam grades or my achievements. It doesn't mean that all individuals are materialists. And that may be exaggerating to a point, but the core of my argument is individualism allows you to achieve the more meaningful and the more material benefits. Collectivism does neither.
Thank you. I'd like to draw the proposition to an argument that was briefly made on the side of the opposition. I'd like to bring the debate back to that. We talked earlier about the idea of communities and how someone could be excluded from a community. There's this concept of in-group bias, for example. We see those who are outsiders to us in a less positive light to those who are part of our group. And I'm sure most of us here have seen that. We'll all probably say we go to the best college. We probably all think our sports team's the best too, regardless of whether that's actually true. So going on from that, does a community that does not value individualism not exclude individuals who do not conform to that society's view of what is right?
Okay, I would say, yeah, it's the point on individualism being the kind of realization, being the ability for people who are out, as you said, traditionally excluded groups. The idea that individualism is the only means to get them in, I disagree with, because for any system that allows people to come in needs the idea to work together and to build bridges to move people in. You'll never have minority rights unless the majority, and in the end, can be persuaded to change over time. So the idea that we have achieved any minority rights just because of the vocal kind of expression of a few minorities, I don't think is right. I think change happens when you persuade people to come along with you, and that requires the kind of non-individualistic response. So that'd be the first thing I'd say to that. Also, secondly, I don't believe that just because we're arguing individualism is failing, we're not arguing for the idea that we need to have a collective or a kind of suppressed, harmonious village in Denmark. And I think what we're trying to say is that individualism is failing because it doesn't meet up to its own self-prescribed ideals, and it doesn't meet the necessary standards that we believe should be judged from whether an idea is good or not for our health and our lives.
Hi, I'd like to ask a question to the opposition. I'm a bit unclear as to if I was to vote for you at the end, what I would be voting for, because particularly your argument, second speaker, appears to be that individualism is not failing because individualism is the only thing that we have. There is no opposite, there's no alternative. It is inherent within all of us. But well, that isn't really an argument. What tenets of individualism are there that mean it is not failing? That's not really, I wouldn't consider that an argument to just say that, well, because individualism is part of any system, whether it's collectivist or not, because any collectivist system is built upon individualism. Well, that may be true, but surely you have some thoughts as to what an ideal individualist system might look like, some propositions as to how that is preferential to collectivism. Otherwise, I personally wouldn't consider that a good enough argument. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that and just some specific examples of what you would like me to vote for. The point I made is that individualism is just simply what we are. And if we say it to be failing, I think we're saying that the human condition in itself is failure, and that we can't be happy, we can't like that. I think individualism is simply the everyday reality, and it's not a form of living together. So I think you asked to sort of give an example of how a sort of individualist approach could look like. But I think any form of living together which values its members fully and allows them to make their own decisions about who they are and who they want to be, that is an individualist. And I think you can be an individualist and very strongly believe in working together and in the power of bringing people together, and indeed I do, only when you make sure that in working together, you still allow everyone to express themselves. So for example, and one example I gave in my speech was in Soviet Russia, for example, people worked together, but they worked only to an extent, because a lot of things such as, opposing political views, you couldn't express those, and in many sense, people couldn't express their individuality. But there are many examples as well, I think, of groups, maybe not in the many millions of people, that's quite hard, but especially in smaller groups where you can work together, do fantastic things together while still allowing each and every one of the members to be their own individual self.
I think you raised a really important question, which is what are you voting for if you oppose the motion? And the answer is, you're saying that the current system, the current ideology which underpins the whole Western world has not failed, is not debunked. It doesn't mean it's thriving, doesn't mean the Western world has no faults, which all of us will happily condemn, but that the system hasn't failed. And the points that the opposition are unified on is that, firstly, individualism as a concept hasn't failed. The ideological and philosophical underpinnings, which we've gone on extensively about, haven't failed. But also the secondary point, which we've sort of swayed away from, is that to say a system and an idea has failed in any meaningful sense is to say that it's significantly worse than the alternatives. And the reason why it's important, despite the proposition denying it, is that we must compare it to other systems around the world, the most prevalent being collectivism, and say how much better or worse is are individualist societies to collectivist ones. You can pick whichever example you think best represents that, whether that's China, whether that's countries in the Middle East, whether that's countries in Africa. And so to say that individualism is not failing would be to say that the individualist societies of the Western world are not significantly worse than those such societies.
Hello. My question is mainly for the opposition, mainly the person on the right, so I forgot your name, so sorry about that. So you mentioned in your speech that the pursuit of one's own dreams and going to a top university like Cambridge is down to individualism, yet previously you also said, oh, what's the alternative to individualism? China. However, Chinese students do go to top universities such as Cambridge and Oxford and do pursue their dreams and, do have, individualistic goals. So either China isn't the alternative to individualism, like you said, or it's not individualism that allows people to achieve their dreams and pursue their goals. So my question is, which one is it?
What you have essentially described is what I mentioned earlier about nuance. There is no 100% collectivist regime. There are places like China which are collectivist with individualist elements. Oh yes, we may have locked up millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps and forcibly sterilized them because they are a threat to the collective, but at least a few of our students get into top universities. That's an element of individualism within a collectivist system. I'm not saying that. Yeah. I'm not saying that, I'm saying this for the purpose of the debate. But what I will say to you on a personal level, addressing your earlier point, is that that is an example, and we can use less extreme examples in China. For example, Denmark, there are Danish students in Cambridge, like myself. My father left Denmark to go to a university in the UK, and it is possible. But my argument is that if a society, if a culture is fundamentally collectivist, it is harder to do that. And if people do that, they face more obstacles and they face more stigma. And it is through an individualist society, one that places the individual heart and center, where that stigma and those obstacles are removed. I hope I answered your original point, China.
Yeah, so you mentioned that like it's an individualist society that allows it to be easier to go to a top university, and it's harder to sort of like get into a top university through a collectivist society. However, like individualism and like the pursuit of individualism, especially like in the United States through Reaganist politics, or in the UK through Thatcherite politics, led to, you know, millions of people both in the north of England, in Scotland, in the Rust Belt in the United States losing their jobs due to the crushing of the unions. Such people, including my own dad and my own grandma on my mum's side, losing their jobs in the textile mills in my hometown in the north. And that led to incredible amounts of poverty in those sorts of areas. You know, in my area, I think it's about a quarter of children live in poverty. And because of that, you know, lots of people don't have access to books, don't have access to lots of, you know, sort of like reading material or any sort of educational material. Some of them don't get proper nutrition to actually sort of develop at a regular rate compared to someone who, say, went to Eton and has all those things and has parents who went to university. And I would argue that that is down to an individualist society prioritizing the individual and saying, oh, we don't need unions, or crushing down on unions, which is fundamentally a collectivist principle. I don't really have a question. I'm just making a counterpoint, really. So I'm not sure what I'd say, but yeah, there you go.
One more response on this.
So I think there were two elements in your response. I think the first was in relation to the crushing of the unions. I have said in my speech, I am not advocating for unqualified individualism. Do I think that there should be collectivist elements within an individualist system? Yes. Do I think that crushing unions is wrong? Yes. So, and on to the second point, I think that is very much just due to the bastard Tory government not caring about people, not necessarily due to individualism. I do think that individualism means a society that allows individuals to realize their aspirations. A Tory government who cuts funding to all schools prevents individuals from realizing their aspirations. And I think it is similar in many collectivist systems where they have an idea of what the collective should do, whether that's agriculture or whether, you know, everyone should work in the same industry, industrial. We don't want you ending up in Oxbridge. We do not care about your individuality. I think that very much is a collectivist principle, not necessarily, but there is that element. And I certainly wouldn't chalk it up to individualism. I do think that in a pure individualist society, pure as in one that fulfills its aims, not that has no collectivist elements, individuals, wherever they are, would be able to realize their ambitions. Perhaps not under a Tory government.
So the speaker who just spoke was talking about sort of individualism, but with communitarian aspects. My question is really based around what's the difference between that and a more communitarian system of individualistic aspects? You know, the national religion of this country is not Church of England, it's NHS, which is, of course, a communitarian sort of aspect of this country. A lot of the people here have benefited from state education. A lot of people here have benefited from welfare. So, yeah, what's the difference in your mind?
I think you've raised a good point in that it's very much a spectrum rather than individualism, collectivism, and something in the middle. But I do think that this country, and this country isn't the most successful country. I think elements of that could be down to individualism and to collectivism. But I do think that individualism means you place individualism, you place the individual at the heart of society. And then you have elements like the welfare state, like the NHS, which I do think are necessary. That is partly why the United States is a complete failure, at least in comparison to us. But this does not suggest that we are a collectivist society by any means. Even Denmark, the example I mentioned, it's satire. It's hardly a collectivist society, at least compared to more extreme examples mentioned by the opposition, for example, Soviet Russia and China. It's just that once you start moving towards these collectivist elements within society, then it starts getting more dangerous. So I do think that, and in essence, something like the NHS is still very much founded on protecting the individual and protecting the community through the individual, not so bottom up, not top down. And so I don't think that having collectivist elements to an extent has any bearing on the failings of individualism.
I'd just like to firstly reiterate the point that's just been made, that sitting before you aren't three avid Thatcherites who are supporting laissez-faire economics. And we'd like to, as a collective, apologize and express shame for what happened to your family and your community. When we're also not, the fact that we're not advocating Thatcherism is a testament to that individualism isn't about promoting individual interests and competition. It's about placing the individual at the heart. And I'd just like to expand, he says it far more eloquently than I do, but I'd just like to say, we're not talking about broad philosophical concepts which aren't applicable to the everyday. These things are turned into empirical evidence. And when we talk about the UK and the US being more individualistic than other regimes, it's because they've been quantified by different methodologies. I don't want to go into the statistics, but it's used then by the army to try and work out what the mindsets are of nations, how communitarian or how individualistic they are. And so what we're talking about isn't some hazy philosophical idea, but the actual practicalities of whether we are an individualistic or communitarian system.
It's good debating with your friends because you know when they're lying. Ollie used to be a Thatcherite. Ollie has now converted. Yeah. Ollie has converted, and I can find evidence of it. Anyway, that wasn't my main point. My main point was that the speaker on the end is quite keen to grab hold of examples of good individualism in countries that he likes and then reject because it's nuanced aspects. So the gentleman who asked about China and whether it was individualism or that allowed them to get in, like you said, using your own example, or it was or China was bad because it wasn't individualistic. I'd like to point out that you can't just dismiss criticism as nuance. I don't believe you actually answered that point. I think you just tried to reject it by claiming it was nuanced, and I'd like to give it another go.
This system with individualist ideas, and let's forget nuance. Let's analyze China based on its collectivism and individualism. As I said, I don't think the fact that some individuals, very certain individuals, I have friends on the other side of the spectrum, friends from Hong Kong who are afraid of giving their real views because they'll be locked up in a concentration camp or incarcerated, never to be seen again when they get back home. But yeah, the fact that some Chinese students end up in top universities, a sign of individualism. I think a more prominent one is that, China is very successful in the Olympics because they like to show their strength through their athletes. But at the core of society, for the everyday person, not for the gold medalists or the Cambridge students, it is a collectivist society, which is very damaging to its members, especially its minorities. And I don't think that you can weigh up the effects of collectivism being genocide on one hand and the effects of individualism being top universities on the other and say, oh, well, forget nuance, it's working.
The reason why we asked that was because we wanted to demonstrate that this is not a debate about individualism versus collectivism. It's a debate on whether individualism is failing. And we don't actually believe you pair them off. We're arguing that individualism is failing because of the examples we've set out. What you've tried to do is paint us as collectivists when we're not collectivists, and that's not what we're arguing for. Try to use that example to demonstrate that this is not a debate between the two. This is a debate about whether individualism is failing or not.
I've seen that the floor sort of broadly has been dragging politics into this. So I think we should address that briefly. I really don't think there's a strong link between, say, individualism and Thatcherism on the one hand, and a more collectivist approach, and Labour policies on the other hand. So, for example, personally, I consider myself to be quite left-wing, quite strongly, pro-unions, pro-state education. But that's not what individualism is about. I think, for example, that state-funded education is very good because it allows many more people within our society to express their individuality instead of it being restricted to the rich. It's really not as simple as connecting individualism to some political system. Like we've heard a lot of comparisons where the US is inherently individualist, and then some of the flaws that the US are brought in earlier. I think abortion laws were mentioned. But that's all taking a lot of different steps, because I would say that laws that allow abortion are individualist because they allow individuals to make choices for themselves. You can't just tie individualism to some political system, and important points about unions, Thatcherism and the effects of that, they aren't about individualism, just as the proposition doesn't want to be mischaracterized as avid collectivists. We don't want to be mischaracterized as avid neoliberal Thatcherites, I think.
As Elliot said, the benefit of debating against a friend is that you can see they learn their trickery and tactics in the Communist Party to trick out their opponents. And it was a nice effort, but we aren't trying to say that individualism versus collectivism is the motion that we are arguing about. The reason we're bringing collectivism into this debate is because we're comparing it to alternatives. To say a single regime is failing is saying that it's significantly worse than any viable alternative, if we're being practical. But even more significantly, the question is individualism failing? And you haven't provided any real argument as to why individualism, i.e. the system which the whole Western world is predicated upon, is failing as a whole. And more significantly, the reason we are comparing the two systems is because we're trying to show the benefits of individualism, these can be expressing individual interest, the philosophical side, or the political side about protecting human rights. And the reason we're doing this is to show that as a system, it's not failing.
Firstly, I'd just like to ask the opposition, namely speakers 2 and 3. I mean, I think speaker 2 noted that happiness derives from individualism, whereas speaker 3 noted how Denmark is not particularly an individualist society. Why then would Denmark be one of the happiest societies in the world, as is Finland, as is Sweden, as is Norway, as is Iceland, as is Bhutan, even though none of them are particularly individualistic? And secondly, doesn't the fact that there exists almost no pure individualist society in the world, and it has to be mixed with some level of collectivist policies, whether that be the NHS, whether that be state education, illustrate that in its purest form, individualism is failing? Thank you.
Okay, so number one, just said represent a spectrum of views, but I'm going to address the second point first. So I think that's, if you want to make an emotion of this House believes individualism in its purest form would fail, you might be right. But I think if you apply that to anything, if you substitute individualism out for communism in its purest form, capitalism in its purest form, put any ism in its purest form, and it will most likely fail. I don't think that's how you can define the motion. And as for the first point, you raise a very interesting argument. Yes, these are all the happiest, supposedly happiest countries in the world. Because why? I accept in a collectivist system, a greater average of happiness will be produced. But if you look at the suicide rates of Denmark, of Norway, of Finland, of Iceland, they're much higher than the other individualist societies. So they might be happier overall, but that has a cost. That has a deadly price, because as I mentioned, those outsiders, the people who do not feel part of this collectivist system, they are left out. And do we really want to prioritize a greater average of happiness over the sorrow and, in the extreme case, deaths of those who feel left behind?
Again, a point which you raised earlier, there are often a lot of factors at play. These nations are all rich, they are green, they have good education, they are peaceful. There's so many things that make people happy or unhappy. And you mentioned how I said that individualism makes us happy. What I meant is that every single situation we approach as individuals, there is only individual happiness. There is no collective happiness. Collective happiness is simply individual happiness in multiple people at the same time due to a common cause. I'm not arguing that individualism as some sort of political strategy makes us happy. All I'm saying is that we are happy as individuals and as individuals only. And in whatever way we do that, how many other people we invite to share our happiness, it remains something we always very fundamentally approach as individuals.
I think I'll take one more question from the audience, or two more questions.
Yeah, I mean, you say you're not Thatcherites, but then you also say, oh, the collective happiness of the society is just lots of individual happiness. Isn't that just what Thatcher said? There's no such thing as a society, it's just a group of individuals or something like that. I can't remember what she said. I've got too many example sheets bumping around in my head, but it's something like that. And I'm sure, you know, you probably know what I'm on about.
Yeah, sorry, mine was for this side here. I was just going to say that you said that your position was not that individualism is a bad thing as such, but just that it's something that is failing in its current state. So, and that you're not collectivist either. So if individualism is failing, how would you remedy that? We'd remedy it by trying to focus on correcting it, correcting the flaws that we think are present in it, which is namely that the drive towards isolating you outside and focusing people in on values in life, which we don't think leads to a greater overall happiness. So the way that we try and do that is to get individualism back onto the course that's originally intended to make people's lives better and allow themselves to be happy and free. And the way we do that is to try, well, I can't design a system off the top of my head because I'm not that clever, but what we're trying to say is that the current system of individualism is failing, and to recognize that fact, because to recognize that fact is the first step in trying to work out a way that you can actually get individualism back on track to make people's lives actually better. So I'm sorry I don't have an example, but we're trying to get it along.
I'm glad the opposition and proposition are now unified on the point that individualism is something to be championed, and the way to rectify it is to have more individualism. The application of it is, we agree, often misconstrued and done poorly, but the way to resolve our issues is to have more individualism.
I think this has been addressed in the last few points, but I think I'd like to bring the debate back to the question of, like, so if individualism, if the point of it is to allow the individual to attain their own individual wants and needs, there's two sides to it. There is the positive, sort of the lack of constraints on individual action, and we talked about those with communitarianism. And then there's also the positive ability to attain those. And I think this is somehow a bit of the core of the debate between the proposition and the opposition, is sometimes the proposition is saying, well, look, it might be that the goal is good of individuals attaining their wants and needs, but actually society is not able to provide this. So I think there is just a bit of a lack of clarification on both sides, whether we're talking about the actual goal of individualism or, and I noticed a little bit of, tension in both sides of the goal versus the actual actualization of individualism. So yeah.
Can they go first? I'll respond very briefly and then hand it over to someone on my team who'll probably disagree with me. But well, no, they'll just say it better. The point of individualism is this, and the core contention of this debate is not between negative liberty and positive liberty. Should we be constricting, allowing people to achieve their self-realization or preventing harm from them? That's all subsumed by individualism. That's expressed in the breadth of thinkers who support individualism, ranging from rules, as has been mentioned, who supports this idea of positive liberty, which we're talking about, to the people who believe in a strong, stringent form of capitalism as there can be. So this isn't the contention of debate between positive and negative liberty, because all of that is subsumed within individualism.
Just in the sense to wrap up on my end, and I think both of us will agree this, in that the core of this debate, in a sense, has moved away from the ideological into a definition of the motion. The proposition has said, this is our definition of what individualism should do. Individualism in its current form does not meet that, therefore it has failed. Whereas for us, we have defined the motion as individualism as an ideology is not a failure. We believe that individualism as a concept is not failing because it is the best compared to all the other alternatives. And I don't think that narrowing down the motion to this is what individualism should be, it does not meet this impossibly high ceiling, therefore it has failed, is a motion you should be voting for. The motion is this House believes individualism is failing, and it is our contention that individualism has not.
One more response from the audience.
I just had a quick question for the opposition. I feel like really there's been two definitions that have been in play in this debate. The first one's the philosophical individualism, which I think the opposition's done a better job of convincing me about. But there's also the other definition, which is political individualism, which I think is what the proposition's been more arguing, which is actually how it's applied in its political scheme. So which is, it's a different thing than philosophical individualism, because philosophical individualism is all about placing the emphasis on the individual worth and self-dignity, whereas the political individualism is more about should political parties and governments endorse individual actions and focus on the individual in legislation in order to pass their, in order to achieve the best result for society. I think it's on that latter one where I'm a little less convinced by the opposition. And I was just wondering what the opposition could put forth in terms of why political individualism is succeeding, because I think the opposition themselves have kind of admitted that actually in a lot of ways, our society is too individualistic in its policies and that we should be endorsing more collectivist policies like trade unions. But if that's the case, then that seems to suggest to me by definition that individualism is failing, because it's failing in its political application rather than its philosophical application. So I was just wondering, does the opposition actually have an argument as to why it's actually succeeding in terms of political individualism, other than just going for a worst case scenario in China, which is true, but that's just, I guess there's nuance, as the opposition points out, which is that you can have the two schemes working at the same time. And that's what the opposition themselves have pointed out and said it would work better. And yet they're expecting me to think that individualism isn't failing, despite the fact that you're saying it is failing politically. So I was just wondering what kind of response you had to that.
Yeah, so I think what you've called political individualism, I would call that right-wing economic policy, and I don't think that is necessarily individualist, or that its opposite is necessarily anti-individualist. I think that what you call the philosophical sense of individualism is the only relevant sense and I think that there are policies which you describe as individualist, which may not be serving our society, but I don't think there's a clear-cut political way to view individualism. You can view it in many different ways, and some individualists argue that all taxation is theft. I think that's quite idiotic. And there are also many individualists who weirdly wish others well, just as they wish well on themselves. People can be individualists, but also generally nice. Being individualist isn't the same as being selfish or being, as long as I'm happy, then it's fine. Some are, unfortunately. But I think as soon as you enter that political spectrum, it becomes much more complicated than just individualism or something else.
I think we'll wrap up today. I just want to say a final thank you for everyone for coming, especially the speakers, and for really great discussion and questions. Also, final promo, King's Politics and Fitz Debate. We all have a lot of events planned for the rest of Michaelmas and the following year. So do like us on Facebook and look at all our events. And just want to say final thank you to everyone. We do have a social at King's Bar and also at Fitz Bar if people want to trek up the hill, but everyone is welcome. Tom, do you want to say anything else?
Cool. Yeah, massive thank you all for coming and for participating so much this evening. It definitely really makes it much better when the audience is really going for it too. One thing about the King's Bar, there's a BME music night on tonight. So if you're hanging around in King's, just be aware of that. I think there's a quiz starting at 8:30, which was about 3 minutes ago. So that'll be happening if you want to jump in a little bit halfway through. And the other thing was, I think we need to have a vote on the motion. So who agrees that individualism is failing? Okay, 23-ish, give or take. Who thinks individualism is not failing? Slightly less. We'll call it 15, something like that. Cool, awesome job. Thanks to all the speakers.